Right, we are coming in. So, hello everyone. We are in for the first video for our month of November here. And as I always typically do with the month of November, the subject of World War One is a historical topic that is perhaps one of my most favorite subjects to go into. And thus, every November, we delve into a little bit of World War One history with a video or two relating to that conflict. So, for the first of the videos, I have two at least planned for this month for this particular year regarding World War One. But for the first of the two videos that we're going to do regarding what some events that happened in World War One in the past, we have covered. I believe we've covered, the Treaty of Versailles. We covered the German Revolution. We covered World War One in general. We've covered the Russian Revolution as well. This is going to deal with another of the Central Powers, one that technically started the war, but ultimately didn't live long enough and didn't live through the war. Now, if you know your history a little bit, you know of a country that started World War One called Austria-Hungary, and or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was as it was otherwise also known. And it sat as one of the great powers of Europe at the start of the war in 1914. Austro-Hungary had been formed back in 1867 through a compromise that had come about among the Austrian emperor and his Hungarian subjects, in which the Hungarians would be almost a co-equal part in the empire. They would have more equal rights to the German Austrian majority that was the main ruling class, so it formed kind of a compromise state. Before 1867, it had simply been known as the Austrian Empire, but that changed with Hungary gaining co-equal status in this so-called dual monarchy, where the Emperor of Austria was also at the same time the King of Hungary. And before 1914, Austro-Hungary was one of the leading powers in European affairs. It was a great power, it was a respected power. However, it was not without its faults, and it definitely had its weaknesses, which would come to glaring prosperity during the First World War. And perhaps one of the biggest hindrances to the Austro-Hungarian state was the factor that it was not an empire made up of just one or two ethnicities. It comprised of over 10, and it had, I believe, even smaller amounts of even further minorities, such as, Romanians and even Italians. But among the main 10 that we're talking about here that made up the ethnicities of Austria-Hungary, it had Germans, which the Austrians were. Austria, and by and large, is a German country. It's just the part of Germania that did not unite with the other German states when it formed the German Empire in 1871, because it already had its own empire. So Austrians are technically ethnic wise they are Germans, but they nationality wise they are Austrians. It also had Hungarians, who formed the second largest part of the empire, but it also comprised of people of Polish ethnicity, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Italians, Slovenes, Bosnians, all kinds of people. And that would end up kind of being a major problem going into the First World War, because for decades after 1867, the smaller ethnic minorities within the empire, like the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenes, they all envied this semi-equal status that the Hungarians had got granted to them, and they wanted some of that for themselves. They wanted increased self-rule for their different peoples. They wanted some self-independence within the empire, and the imperial government was not willing to give that. That would create ethnic conflicts that would also come about, and of course, during World War One, these conflicts would ultimately tear the empire apart. It would not survive the First World War. Germany, yes, Germany also lost the First World War, but Germany still came out of the war relatively intact. There was still a German nation. At the end of World War One, there was no Austro-Hungarian Empire. In fact, by the time the technical armistice had been signed with the Austro-Hungarian army on November 3rd, so just would have been yesterday, by the time that armistice was actually signed, Austria-Hungary didn't even really exist. There wasn't even really an Austria-Hungary that existed at the time they officially signed an armistice, because already large parts of the former empire had already started to break away and declare independence, which is what we're going to take a look at today. So we are going to take a look at, toward the end, well, mostly focusing on the end here, but we're going to take a look at the dissolution of Austria-Hungary and how this great power that did technically initiate World War One ultimately would end up being destroyed by it. and leave a power vacuum in Central Europe that was rapidly kind of weakened the region. I mean, you had a bunch of new republics that got established, but they were young, they were inexperienced, and that left them vulnerable to conflicts to come in the coming decades, most notably World War II. So, as we mentioned, Austria-Hungary was formed in 1867. It is a multi-ethnic state of over at least 10 different ethnicities, and each one of those ethnicities, I believe, if I remember right, the Austro-Hungarian national anthem had to be translated into over 14 different languages just for its different ethnic peoples to understand it and be able to recite it. The multi-ethnic makeup of the empire would cause much internal strife, which would amplify during World War I, but it had been there prior. Now, for those of us who know our general history of how World War I started, we know that World War I began in July of 1914, about a month after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. Now, Bosnia-Herzegovina was a province that Austria-Hungary had annexed back in 1908. It had done so relatively with some controversy because it was not something that Russia was very keen to. Russia saw itself as a protector of its fellow Slavic peoples, of which the Bosnians and the Serbs within Bosnia were, and it kind of got fooled into a deal that allowed Austria to technically claim that they had Russian, they had Russian permission to take this province without a problem, and that led to a whole nother diplomatic crisis. But nonetheless, Bosnia Herzegovina is right next to a Slavic neighbor in the Balkans, right next to Austria-Hungary, one that Austria-Hungary had long had some grievances with ever since it had regained its independence and started to kind of agitate for the Serbs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire to stage their own independence movements and join Greater Serbia. And that country of Serbia would be a thorn in Austria's side for many years. Now, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, he was going in a car ride through the capital of Sarajevo I believe it was June 28th of 1914. He ended up having some assassins try to kill him. They first tried to throw some bombs into his car as he was traveling along the streets. They missed. They did kill some of his guards, but he managed to get away safe with his wife. They drove quickly down and got away from him. Now, later, the the poor Franz Ferdinand, he decided he wanted to go visit the people that had been injured in the hospital, so his driver tries to take him to the hospital. Unfortunately, he makes a wrong turn and has to stop the car and turn it around. What That was the fatal error, because in the time that it would take the driver to stop the car and turn this thing around, he happened to stop right in front of a cafe where one of the undetected assassins was waiting and just could not believe his luck that the Archduke had stopped right in front of him. And he took his opportunity. He walked right up, fired two shots. One hit the Archduke's wife, and the other one hit him. They both died within a couple of minutes. Thus, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was dead. Now, it was later found out that the assassins who would carry out this gruesome murder had been employed by a terrorist Serbian organization that was somehow linked back to the official government of Serbia. It was whether or not those links were entirely plausible, as whether or not the Serbian government had actually, orchestrated this assassination, that was not true. But the terrorist organization called the Black Hand did have ties to officials within the Serbian government. So it's still debated to this day as to how involved the Serbian government was, but there definitely was some contact between them and this group. That angered Austria, who now saw that this was a blatant attempt by their thorny neighbor to now kill the heir to the throne and end the Habsburg monarchy that had ruled in the area for hundreds of years at this point. So they see this as we've been attacked, we're going to war, we're crushing Serbia. They get German backing in early July, and by July 28th, after issuing a short ultimatum to Serbia that they did not agree to all the terms, they would invade. Serbia refused the final term, and Austria declared war on July 28th of 1914, thus starting what would become World War I, as it would become a rapid domino effect. Russia, which saw itself as Serbia's protector, would intervene in the war and start mobilizing to go against Austria. Germany, Austria's ally, would then mobilize against the Russians and threaten to invade them. The Russians were allied with the French, who would then follow in and threaten Germany, and then Britain would come in when the Germans invaded neutral Belgium in order to go to France. It was just a rapid domino effect. So that starts the First World War, mostly because Austria Hungary had responded to an assassination of its heir to the throne. Now, while it was technically the instigator of the conflict that would become known as the Great War, Austria never really played a prominent role in the Central Power Alliance as its big ally, Germany. It often struggled militarily throughout the conflict and often struggled to do anything significant successfully on its own without some support from their German ally. And for example, in 1914, the Austro-Hungarian forces, which greatly outnumbered the Serbian forces in Serbia, were unable to even take Serbia in 1914. Serbia, despite being a tiny little country on the empire's southern border, was not conquered the very first start of the war, and this was a major setback because this should have been an easy job, and it was not. The Austro-Hungarians failed to take Serbia in 1914, and they did not take it until 1915, only when the Germans came in to help them, and they managed to secure the alliance with Bulgaria, which was Serbia's eastern neighbor that was also had some grievous issues with it. So it took them a full year, 2 years before they actually managed to conquer the one country that they had started this whole little spat over. And they only managed to do so once they received help from their allies. They could not do it on their own. Another big area that Austria-Hungary definitely struggled at in the First World War was they struggled immensely at fighting on the Eastern Front of the war against the Russian Empire. Now, the Russian Empire has a bad rap for World War One, that it was not the most militarily adept, that it had its problems, and that is true. It definitely had its struggles in World War One. Russia was not the most industrialized compared to the other Allied powers, but it did do remarkably well against Austrian forces, and that is something that I think often gets forgotten. The Russians struggled on the Eastern Front typically when they went against the German armies. Germany was, the most powerful military in terms of, what their military could do and training wise. Germany was most ready, capable for war. Russia had the largest in terms of manpower, but it wasn't always the most efficient because they lacked weapons, they lacked artillery, they lacked, training in some instances. So, although Russia had larger manpower, Germany had the largest fully trained regular army available at the start of the war. So, when the war goes out, the Russians struggle against the Germans immensely. They struggle against the Germans in almost every single battle they engage them in. The Austrians, however, aren't so lucky. The Austrians are relatively weak to the Russians. The Russians are actually able to make quite a few victories against the Austro-Hungarian forces when they move against them, primarily in the region in Poland known as Galicia. And this would continue through 1916, with the Russians coming in, being able to batter the Austro-Hungarian forces, and the Austrians only being saved from utter defeat by getting their German allies to send reinforcements and come and help them. So constantly, Germany was having to bail out its ally that had started the war because their army was absolutely incapable of actually mounting the defense that they needed to be doing, which kinda hindered Germany's efforts because at the start of the war, the plan was, "I'm gonna try to knock France out in 6 weeks. I'm not gonna have a lot of troops being able to fight the Russians immediately. You guys need to be able to take on the Russians on your own until I can handle France." "Sure, we can do that." No, you could not. Germany had to keep bailing them out, diverting units from the west to help their, militarily weaker ally, and that cost them troops on the Western Front to use in those battles. Not to mention, in 1915, Austria Hungary had their situation even worsened by a three front war. They had a war against Serbia to their south, a war against the Russian Empire to their east, and in 1915, Italy, which had territorial aspirations and arguments with Austria Hungary for decades, declared war on the Austro Hungarian Empire and joined the Allies, opening a third front in the western part of the country. And this would utterly stretch the already weakened Austro-Hungarian military to its breaking point. They could not fight on a three-front war. This was not a good thing, and it ended up being a deadlock on the Western Front in the Alps, where neither the Austrians nor the Italians could really break through the mountain passes. At the Alfonso River Valley alone, there were 12 battles that were fought, and only on the 12th battle of the Asonzo, otherwise known as the Battle of Caporetto, in I believe it was October of 1917, did the Austrians manage to finally break through the Italian lines, but they only did this because the operation was under German leadership and it was led by German forces along with Austro-Hungarian. Now, Austria-Hungary would suffer its most damaging military defeat in World War I with the Russian Brusilov Offensive of June of 1916. This was the most successful offensive that the Russians were able to mount during the First World War. It used, for the first time, the Russians were using shock trooper tactics of an intense artillery barrage in different areas of the front, while also attacking simultaneously against all lines of that front instead of just one specific point, while at the same time sending their troops while the artillery was still firing to go in and actually, start attacking these positions, which caught the Austro-Hungarians drastically off guard. And since they were attacking along the entire front line, the Austrians didn't know where to send and prioritize certain points because they didn't know, what points were more threatened than others. So they couldn't really, they couldn't determine that, hey, the center of the line is the weakest point. We need to send a majority of our troops there. No, they're attacking all along the front line. They don't know what area is more important to defend than the others because there's equal force on all of them. Now, the Brusilov offensive would have the drastic effect. It essentially broke the Austro-Hungarian army in World War One, and the only reason that Austro-Hungary was saved from actually exiting the war and having signed a surrender with Russia was because there was a lack of coordination on the Russian side to go once the initial breakthrough was made. General Alexei Brusilov, who was leading this offensive, he did not get the cooperation of the other Russian generals that he needed in order to make this further successful. He pushed the Austrians, I believe, all the way back to the Carpathian foothills of the Carpathian Mountains is where he got them. So right going into Hungary. And had he continued and had it been a success, Austria-Hungary likely would have been knocked out of the war. Unfortunately for him, he did not get the cooperation that he needed, and the Austrians, already pushed past their breaking point, called in for their big brother to come help them, of which the Germans were forced to send troops away from Verdun and from the Somme in order to help. Well, the Somme would have happened about a month later, but it would affect them too. And they had to pull troops away from both of those points to come help out their Austrian ally and bail them out of utter defeat. Now, the Brusilov offensive, it would essentially be the end of the Austro-Hungarian army as its own independent entity, because after this point, Germany would the Germans kind of argued this battle proved that the Austro-Hungarians were incompetent to be able to operate militarily on their own and that they needed German guidance. And this necessitated the Germans taking over large military operational planning of the Central Powers war effort for the remainder of the war. The Austro-Hungarian army essentially came under German command, which then at the same time kind of questions, was Austria-Hungary a fully independent sovereign power at that point? Because Germany is now starting to exercise control over some of its internal affairs, such as the use of its military and military coordination and planning. So that would start to erode the Austro-Hungarian Empire's thing, and that at the same time would start the initial, the military downfall of the empire is secured at that point. But the empire hasn't dissolved yet. Now, as the war continued, the ethnic divisions that we mentioned that existed in Austro-Hungary, they would become much more problematic as the longer the war went on. Certain groups at the outbreak of the conflict were very reluctant to enlist in the Austro-Hungarian war effort. They didn't really support the war. They weren't Austrians, so they didn't feel as though their honor had been sapped. They weren't Hungarians, so they didn't feel the same way. Many of them didn't have any connection to the imperial family and thought that they were oppressors, so they didn't see a need to go to war in order to defend, the assassination of, the heir to the throne of a person they absolutely hated. To gain the support of the imperial government, to gain support from these ethnic minorities that were hesitant to enlist in the war effort, the imperial government in Vienna would promise some groups, like the Poles, the Czechs, and the Ukrainians within the empire, increased autonomy once the war was over. They promised that if you come and help us, if we win this war and you do your duty to the empire, after the war, we'll talk about giving you, some self government, some self rule. Like you're still going to be part of the empire, but we will be willing to kind of loosen our restrictions on you and let you kind of govern yourselves to a certain degree. And that was to placate these demands among these groups for, greater autonomy within the empire or even independence altogether. However, it had the opposite effect, as the sign from the imperial government that they were willing to negotiate increased autonomy for these ethnic groups made many of the ethnic group of these nationalist leaders start demanding other ethnic groups get autonomy as well and increase their demands even further for further, self-rule and things like that. The divisions between the Austrian Germans and Hungarians would also end up flaring about during
World War One, even though they were technically co-equals within the empire. One of the most notable, one of the most anti-war people in Austro-Hungary going into the start of the war was actually Count Tisza of Hungary, who was, I believe, the prime minister at the time. And he advised Kaiser Franz Joseph I that I do not want Hungary should not go to war. I do not vote for this. Like, this is not a justified means because he was very suspicious of the way the government was rushing to want to go into war, specifically the military staff. And he questioned that to the Kaiser and gave demands over whether over you either do this or I cannot commit Hungary to this war. So Count Tisza of Hungary is an anti-war activist at the very start, and there are technical problems that come about between this alliance between the two because Hungarians and Austrians, although they're co-equals within the empire, they are not always treated as equals, especially by a majority of the military staff who tended to come from Austria more than it did Hungary. Now, allied as the war went on, what would also further some of the dissolution prospects of what's going to end up happening to this empire is the allied nations are making promises of not just autonomy for these peoples, but they're promising if you come and help the allied side, if you revolt against your Austro-Hungarian masters, we will grant you full-on independence if the allies manage to win this war, which is going to further inflame ethnic tensions within the empire because although some are content to just simply pursue greater autonomy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, promise by the allied nations that they are willing to make nation states for these different ethnicities that will grant them their own nation states and their own countries to rule, that is a big boon to some of these nationalists who they want pure independence. They don't want to be under Austro-Hungarian rule anymore. And that is going to further the ethnic tensions that are already there. Now, leftist, liberal, and opposition parties would gradually, as the war continued, since they're generally anti-war, they would generally start to gain power in both Vienna, which was the Austrian capital and the imperial capital as a whole, and in the Hungarian capital of Budapest. And both of these, opposition parties, be it that they were leftist, be it they were liberal, or whatever they started to advocate on behalf of these different ethnic minorities that felt that they were getting absolutely ignored in the decision making that was being made. Now, perhaps another debilitating influence of why the Austro-Hungarian Empire would fall apart, other than its military setbacks and, of course, the flaring ethnic tensions that the war is bringing about, would also be the loss of its longtime ruler. On November 21st of 1916, right in the middle of the war, longtime Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, who had ruled since his ascension to the throne in 1848, so yes, he had a very long rule, from 1848 to 1916, he ended up dying at his palace in Schönbrunn in Vienna. With his death, this long uniting influence among the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy was now gone, and the new Kaiser that would replace him, the new emperor, was his grandnephew Charles, or Karl, as he's often known. If you go there, they call him Karl. He would become emperor. He was very young. He was only, I believe, he wasn't even I think he was about 29. I think he was about 29 years old when he came to the throne. He was a very young man. Now, Kaiser Karl, well, that's what we'll call him here. Kaiser Karl's reign saw Austria-Hungary reassess the military and political situation. Karl was not ignorant. He knew that Austria-Hungary was not faring well in the war. He knew that the war was causing ethnic tensions. He knew that the war was also causing economic problems within the country as well. So he wanted to try to work on getting the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what is the way out here? Because he's starting to see that the empire, if the longer the war continues, the lesser the likelihood that the empire is actually going to survive the war. And that is not something that he wants. He definitely wants to keep the empire alive as long as he can. So, Kaiser Karl's reign would see a reassessment of Austro Hungary's military and political situation. He saw that the war would likely destroy the empire if it was not ended quickly, but he also saw that he was not likely to get any aid from his German ally because Germany was increasingly dominated by its military, and the German general staff were way too consumed with trying to continue the war and try to get some sort of a victory. They were absolutely opposed to almost any negotiated peace with the Allied powers. In early 1917, Austro-Hungary would engage in secret negotiations to reach a separate peace with the Allied nations, which was something they had to do secretly because if the Germans found out that Austro-Hungary was going behind their back and trying to negotiate a separate peace, it was not entirely unlikely that the Germans would just invade Austria because they would see that as a stab in the back betrayal. Germany had gotten into this war because Austria had asked it to come and support it. They did, and now Austria is negotiating behind Germany's back to try to bring about a peace settlement, which, much like the Allies had, no single member was supposed to try to negotiate a separate peace. It was supposed to be, all the Central Powers together or all the Allied powers together. Now, the talks with the Allied officials would end up failing, and later on, the exchanges of these talks were leaked about a year later in April of 1918 after an insult to the French Prime Minister at the time, George Clemenceau, who would be insulted by Austro-Hungarian officials in April of 1918 as being a major obstacle to a negotiated peace. Clemenceau, who felt insulted, then decided, oh, you want to say I'm the obstacle to peace? Well, why don't I just release these conversations we had behind your allies' backs that you were trying to get out of the war and negotiate a separate peace deal with us? He releases the texts of these conversations, which then embarrasses Kaiser Karl, who then has to go to Germany and explain to Kaiser Wilhelm II as to why the French have these documents and supposedly these talks never took place. And it absolutely enraged the Germans, who were incensed at the apparent betrayal of their long ally. And this caused them to take increasing control over Austro Hungarian political and military matters. So gradually, Austro Hungary is losing its sovereignty to Germany. First, because it's not able to militarily perform, and now because of the factor that it's going behind its allies' back and has proven that it's untrustworthy because it's trying to negotiate a separate peace. Karl would try to reassure Kaiser Wilhelm II of his commitment to the Central Powers and that he was only simply pursuing peace for the benefit of all the nations, not just for his own. Whether or not the Kaiser actually bought that, I don't know. I don't know how well that actually went, but I can't imagine it would have been a very happy conversation to have with the man. So here we got a couple pictures that would show here. We don't have a massive bunch for this topic, but I mean, there's further stuff we can go in on this. So here is an image of what the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have looked like during World War One. By the time of World War One, this is the territories they have now hold. The green are those dominated by the Kingdom of Hungary, and those in red are those of the Empire of Austria. Now, nowadays we know Hungary is a lot smaller than this. We also know Austria is like mostly this section right here. All this belongs to other states now. And that is what would end up happening during this dissolution. You have a bunch of Slavs here, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenes. They all, and the Bosnians all live here. This is Bosnia Herzegovina. Down here would be Serbia, who Austria declared war on, and the whole thing started. Over here would be the Russian Empire, near what is now Poland and in Galicia. You have Romania down here. You have the Germans up here, their main ally, and then over here we have Italy, who's got a major war front going on here against the Austrians. You got a war front going on here until 1915, and you got a war front here in on the Russian battlefields as well. And something that I would like to note that I perhaps didn't mention when I went over the military thing is the Austro-Hungarian military performance was so bad that when Romania here ended up thinking that Russia was winning the Brusilov offensive, they ended up joining the war. Now, since Austria-Hungary shares the largest border with Romania, it only made sense that they would probably be the ones to lead the expedition. But Bulgaria, who's just over here to their south, kind of argues, oh no, like we are not partaking in any Central Powers offensive into Romania unless it is under German command because they knew how incompetent Austro-Hungarian military operations had proven to be themselves. So when they did this, when the Central Powers invaded Romania, the overall operation lay under German command because Bulgarian troops and to an extent the Ottoman Turks were refusing to partake in any operation that was headed by the Austro-Hungarians because of their incompetence in military matters. Now, and let's see here, what other ones do we have here that we can show? Here is a picture of Emperor Franz Joseph I, who was the longtime emperor of the empire. He would die on November 21st of 1916, and he had kind of been a long stabilizing influence within the empire. With him gone, his young grandnephew, Charles, or Karl as we're calling him, he would become the last of the Austro-Hungarian emperors. And he is trying to keep the empire together while also starting to realize the reality of the situation and realizing that I need to try to end this war and get out of it, or else we're probably not going to survive as a state. He would be the last of the Habsburgs to rule over Austria. Now, as 1918 dawned, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was also struggling both financially and socially. Famine had gripped almost the entire empire due to the Allied blockade. They had no access to the ocean due to a British Allied blockade, and imports from Russia were also blocked off. There was also the ongoing Spanish flu pandemic that was killing well over millions of people every day in Europe. You had the military losing morale and manpower, factory strikes in multiple cities, and army mutinies becoming common within Austria Hungary itself, and people in general yearning for peace and growing tired of the war effort. It was bringing nothing but suffering to them. They wanted it over with. They were not willing to support the war effort anymore. In January of 1918, American President Woodrow Wilson would release his proposals for ending the war on what he called his 14 points. And one of the 14 points, one of the very specific points that Wilson put in, was a demand that all nationalities in Austria Hungary have the right to national self determination. They have the right to determine what nation they want to live in and form new nations for themselves. So, this would be a big negotiating point of Allied negotiations with Austria-Hungary going into the rest of the final year of the war, 1918, is the right of these smaller ethnic minorities to self-determine what kind of state they're going to live in, whether or not they're going to form their own states or whether or not they want to continue to live under the yoke of another. And that was something that would cause conflict in the peace negotiation. Kaiser Karl, upon getting Wilson's 14 points and realizing that any proposed armistice negotiations and peace negotiations would probably be based off of those, agreed to convene the imperial parliament and allow a confederation to be established that gave each national group self-governance within the empire, something that had been, complained about for years by the different ethnic minorities, but now because he was desperate to preserve his empire, he's finally willing to give it away. Unfortunately, it was a little too late. The nationalist leaders rejected the proposal, seeing that this was coming out of desperation, and instead started to go from more of a self-rule autonomy stance within the empire to they wanted full-on independence. The final collapse of Austria-Hungary would start coming in October of 1918, and this is what I mean when by the time the armistice that ends fighting with Austro-Hungarian forces is signed on November 3rd of 1918, leaving just Germany as the last central power remaining. Austria-Hungary doesn't even technically exist anymore by November 3rd because it had pretty much already started to break apart in October. On October 14th, the collapse would begin, as Austria-Hungary would officially request an armistice based on Wilson's 14 points. Desperate to preserve Habsburg rule, Kaiser Karl would proclaim his People's Manifesto on October 16th. In this manifesto, he proposed turning the Austro-Hungarian Empire into 5 different equal kingdoms, one for Austria, one for Hungary, one of Bohemia, which would incorporate the Czechs, it was the Czechs' homeland, one for Croatia, for the Croats, and one for Polish Galicia, which would include some of the Poles and the Ukrainians. Thus, trying to break up the empire in a way that it would still be under Habsburg rule and it would still be a united empire, but it's 5 independent little kingdoms that would now have equal status to, what the Kingdom of Hungary had attained back in 1867. Unfortunately for him, it was not going to go. And one exception was the city of Trieste, which would be given special status because of its Italian ethnicity. It was a highly sought after target of Italy during the war that they wanted to take Trieste on the Adriatic. And this would be under this manifesto that Kaiser Karl was proposing, Trieste would be given some sort of a special status and not be made or incorporated into one of these 5 new kingdoms. The proposal would also propose to unify the Polish lands into a renewed Polish state as a whole, which had been broken up since 1795, mostly because of the Austrians, the Germans, the Prussians, and the Russians. Despite Karl's assertions that his manifesto was proposed for the benefit of all of his subjects within the empire, most viewed it as permission for self determination and viewed it as weakness from the Kaiser. That Karl was essentially giving them permission that if you want to form your own independent states, you may, because I'm willing to pretty much do it within the empire. The American response officially to Austro-Hungary's armistice request would indicate support for the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the South Slavs, like the Croats, the Slovenes, and the Serbs, on October 18th, which would essentially end any hope of negotiating based on the 14 points, as the Americans were now making more than clear that the Allied position was no longer for simple self-determination of these peoples and allowing them some autonomy within the empire. The official position of the Allies was that these individual nations, their causes to form their own independent nations, the Czechs, the South Slavs, and the Slovaks, was now being officially supported as an Allied war aim. So unless these groups were granted independence, there would be no negotiated armistice, and that was already a dead branch in the water, a dead fish in the water, because Austro-Hungary was not quite willing to do that. Karl did not want to do that, but this was essentially the death knell of the empire when it became clear that the Allies, no negotiated peace with the Allies was going to accept, an intact continuation of the dual monarchy, that this was going to come to an end, that any negotiated peace would see a breakup of the empire. And this would it would end up coming pretty rapidly. The Czechoslovak provisional government had officially joined the Allied powers on October 14th. This response from the American Secretary of State would come on just 4 days after that. And very quickly after that, the empire started to break up. The South Slavs had also committed even earlier. They were part of this Allied cause at this point because back a year before, they had committed to forming a large Slavic state with Serbia in a union in the Corfu Declaration. During the final battles on the Italian front, during the Vittorio Veneto campaign, these two groups, the Czechs, I should say three, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and the South Slavs, they would end up breaking away when their national councils started to take on the roles of provisional governments and started to declare independence in their own right, even though they may not have had the authority to do so. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire was so weak at that point that they didn't really have anything that they could do to stop it. The Czechs would declare independence in Prague on October 28th of 1918. That is when they ended up declaring independence. Czechoslovakia would then be declared on October 30th when the Slovaks decided to unify with the Czechs in a unified nation. The South Slavs would also form a new state of the Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs on October 29th of 1918, meaning two huge chunks of the empire are now broken away. And in case you want to know where those are at, we can show you exactly what areas we're talking about. So for Czechoslovakia, now this is a map of the proposed partition of the empire under Karl's manifesto into 5 independent kingdoms. You have Hungary, Austria, Bohemia for the Czechs. You have Galicia for the Poles and the Ukrainians, which is why it has both the Polish and the Ukrainian flag kind of mixed in there, and then one for the South Slavs here. This is what is going to become the state of the Slovenes, the Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs, or however the order is. I'm sorry. But this is essentially going to end up becoming Yugoslavia, is what comes out of this when it unifies with Serbia here. So this whole chunk of the empire is now gone by late October. This up here is now also gone. Czech Bohemia, the Czech homeland is gone, and Slovakia, which extends probably about right here or so, and then this little sliver, that is all going to be Czechoslovakia. So all this is gone. All this is gone. All that's left is the Austrian lands here, the Hungarian lands here a little bit, and what is controlled of Galicia. So the empire is already starting to fracture before the armistice is even signed with the Allies. At home, the union between Austria-Hungary would also fall apart, dooming the end of the empire for its continued future. The Hungarian parliament would vote to terminate the union between Austria and Hungary on October 17th of 1918. The Aster Revolution would follow, which was a relatively I believe it was a mostly peaceful revolution of the opposition government coming into power, and they came into power and they officially dissolved the union with Austria on Halloween of 1918 on October 31st. Hungarian troops would then be recalled by the Hungarian provisional government on November 1st, which they would be called back to the Kingdom of Hungary, that any Hungarian troops that had been scripted into the Habsburg armies from the Kingdom of Hungary were to come home. This would weaken the Austro-Hungarian forces that were left on the front lines, as they were already low on morale, they were already low on manpower. Now their Hungarian contingent is going away because the empire is already breaking up. The Hungarians are no longer in a unified nation with Austria. And this would lead to the Habsburg armies collapsing, which would then, of course, lead to just 2 days later to the armistice with the Allies, with the empire absolutely dissolving as they spoke. So again, the armistice may have been signed between the Allies and Austria-Hungary, but the empire didn't really exist at that point. It was gone. Now, convinced to renounce sovereign authority temporarily, Kaiser Karl would issue a proclamation on November 11th, the day that Germany signed its own armistice, recognizing the right of the Austrian people to form a state of their own. He recognized that the tides of revolution were against him, and on November 11th, he officially gave the Austrian people, "You may form a state without my say so. I give you permission to form a new state of whatever you so desire." The same proclamation would be granted to Hungary 2 days later on November 13th. What is important to understand, though, in Karl's concession to allow both Austria and Hungary to form their own new governments, he didn't technically abdicate. He did not abdicate his throne. He held out hope that one of the two governments would recall him and kind of place him back on the throne. So, although he's giving them permission to form their own governments, unlike Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would technically abdicate and go into exile, I mean, Karl went into exile too. Karl never legally abdicated his throne. He didn't do it in these proclamations. He actually never technically abdicated at all. It was the Austrians who kind of picked him out, and the Hungarians. On November 12th, the German-Austrian National Council would declare a Republic of German Austria, or Deutsch Österreich. And on November 16th, Hungary's government would proclaim the formation of the Hungarian Democratic Republic to stay in its place, which would essentially be the death of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this point. All the different nationalities are going for themselves, they're breaking away, and both Austria and Hungary are separating and forming republic governments and dropping the monarchy. So that leads us to the aftermath here, and I'll show the last of the images we have. So we already showed this, the partition of what Karl was proposing in a last desperate bid to preserve the empire, but it did not work. It absolutely did not work. And here we have an image of some Czech soldiers who were mutineers that are being executed in April of 1918, and this was happening across the Austro-Hungarian army. The different ethnicities were starting to mutiny, they were starting to desert, and this caused even further tensions to flare up in the already cracking empire of these different ethnicities that wanted just out of the war. They were tired of the war, they wanted independence, they're deserting the Austro-Hungarian army, and thus they're paying for it, and then that upsets the population at home. And here we have an image the declaration of Czechoslovak independence. This was a rally taking place on that day in Prague on October 28th of 1918 in what will become the Czechoslovak capital in Czechoslovakia, them declaring independence. And here for a final image, we have a picture of some Hungarians. I don't know if this is in Budapest or not, but during the Aster Revolution on October 31st of 1918, where Hungary is now got an opposition government in power, and they officially declare the union with Austria null and void. Now, the two legal successor states to the former Austro-Hungarian Empire would be determined during Allied peace negotiations to be the Republic of German Austria, the first, which would become the first Austrian Republic, and the Hungarian People's Republic, which would be ultimately become the Kingdom of Hungary. Now, the Allies would negotiate with each of these two powers on a separate basis. Since they were now separate nations, the Allies came up with treaties for each one. The Treaty of Saint-Germain, the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and the Treaty of Trianon. Now, the one with Austria was signed in 1919, and the one with Hungary was signed in 1920. So, as for the end here and of course, we could go into a video, and we might yet at some point go into a video of the two separate treaties with both Austria and Hungary ending the war. We probably will do that at some point to get a better explanation of this, but this is just a general of what each of the two countries, successor states, suffered and why they kind of are their current borders. Austria would lose over 60% of its territory, and the size that it was left with was kind of not good. Austria had almost no natural resources left. It lacked a lot of the factories that it had in what is now Czechoslovakia. It lacked a lot of its natural resources, as we said. It also has an oversized imperial capital. Vienna is meant to be the capital of an empire, and it's now stuck in a country that is not big enough to support it. So Austria loses over 60% of its territory. It is forbidden by the treaty from ever uniting with Germany, which had been a hope of many Austrians once they had broken away out and come kind of on their own. They hoped that the only saving grace might be to, officially unify with Germany. Well, this was forbidden by the Allies from happening. Of course, Hitler didn't adhere to that in 1938 when he announced the Anschluss and actually would annex Austria into Germany for until the end of World War II. And it was forbidden from ever uniting with Germany without League of Nations approval, essentially. It could, but it was very unlikely that it was going to happen legally. And Austria was, as we mentioned, it was left with an oversized capital, no empire to support it, and Austria also struggled with the factor that it had never really been a nation on its own, unlike Hungary. Hungary had been its own separate kingdom for a time. That Austria had never really had separate independence. It didn't know what that was. Now, Austria did pass what was known as the Habsburg Law, which would officially dethrone the Habsburgs, despite Karl never officially having abdicated his throne, and banish the family from Austria altogether. Other family members of the Habsburgs would be allowed to return to Austria if they renounced all claims to the defunct throne. Karl never actually dropped his claims. He actually kept trying different ways to try to get back on the throne in both Austria and Hungary until he ended up dying in 1922. Hungary, by contrast, would lose even more territory. It lost 72% of its overall territory and 62% of its population. It would also lose most of its natural resources. The first Hungarian Republic that was established in the After Revolution would end up being ousted in 1919 by communist leader Bela Kun and establishing his Hungarian Soviet Republic, which would then be ousted later that year in August by Romania after a short war with neighboring Romania with the Hungarian Soviet Republic, which would then lead to the Second Hungarian Republic, which would establish a kingdom without a king. And that's another thing we could definitely take a look at. It's kind of interesting that between World War I and World War II, Hungary was technically a kingdom, but it had no king. And that is something that is kind of curious. New states that ended up coming out of parts of Austria-Hungary after the dissolution of the nation included Czechoslovakia, Poland, Ukraine, and Yugoslavia, among others. And that essentially, I believe, wraps up for this video. So something I might not have done the most in-depth detail, but something I wanted to get the gist of what had happened here, and I think that we largely covered most of those points. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, or anything like that, feel free to put it in the comments section, and I'll be more than happy to go through them when I can get the chance. So this week, of course, would have marked 108 years since these events would have happened largely since 1918. And I wanted to just take a look at this because we never really looked at the Austro-Hungarian Empire in large part. So this was a nice little one, I think, to kind of look at how that actually fell apart because of the war. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week. Next week we should have another World War I video. I'm pointing toward doing American involvement in World War I and how the United States kind of gets drawn into the conflict because, mind you, we were neutral at first, and seeing how we come in at the very end. So maybe taking a look at the American experience within World War I, of which I have a great grandfather that was sent over there as part of the American Expeditionary Force. So we'll discuss that next week, hopefully, and then we'll see where we go from there. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video on World War I that we'll do this time.